Okay, let's do another way to organize data in a histogram. So far we've covered organizing data in a stem and leaf plot, organizing data in a box and whisker. Now we're going to organize some data in a histogram format. And a histogram is really similar to a bar graph. So it starts off with what's called a frequency table. So a frequency table shows the number of overseas visitors to a certain U.S. cities in 1999. Display the data in a histogram. So here's a frequency table. So basically it's saying, went around asking different cities, how many visitors did you have? And in, 5 cities said they had between 0 and 1,000, not 1,000, but a million, because it's times 1,000 visitors. 3 said they had somewhere between 1,100,000 and 2,000,000, and so on. So it's just tailing the responses is what you're doing. So now what you're going to do is you're going to build a histogram based on this information. In a histogram, it's like a bar graph. You have your x-axis and you have your y-axis. Never forget your title. On your x-axis, it's the number of visitors, and on the y-axis is the number of cities. So when you graph it, I have my intervals. So that's really a major difference between a bar graph, because a bar graph just is graphing amounts, and it's not graphing it as intervals. When you graph this, so for the first one, you can see, remember, between 0 and 1,000,000 was 5 cities. And then this one was 3 cities, and so on. So it looks like a bar graph. So what's different? What's different is the intervals. What's different is the bars are touching. Normally in a bar graph, they don't touch. Also, you stay flush over to the y-axis. The first bar will touch the y-axis when the interval starts at 0. If it doesn't start at 0, we move it over slightly. We don't start exactly at the axis. You want to include every single interval, even when there isn't any frequencies or anybody who responded to this number of visitors, because it tells you information. So that's what a histogram looks like, much like a bar graph. So here we are. This shows the number of daily customers a new grocery store has during the first 30 days in business. So one grocery store said they had between 0 and 49. There were 6 people who said that. The number of grocery stores that said they had between 50 and 99 people was 12 grocery stores, and then so on. So we're going to make our histogram based on this information. Remember, the intervals, this is your x-axis right here, and your frequency is your y-axis. So this is your y-axis, this is your x-axis. And there you go. What you need to pay attention to is how you're incrementing on your y-axis. You need to be consistent, and your intervals need to be equal amounts. They can't be different varying amounts. Your bars also need to be the same width. Otherwise, it would be a misleading graph. So there's your histogram. And remember, if it starts at 0, it touches the y-axis wall. All of the bars touch, what makes it different than a bar graph. So now we want to be able to answer some questions based on this histogram. I'm going to show you the question, then I'll come back to the bar graph. It says, how many states have the highest points with elevations of at least 3,751? Keyword, at the very least 3,751. So we go back. The very least 3,751. So you're going to look at this one and this one. So you kind of try to determine approximately where does that bar go and where does this bar go, and you put the both of them together, and you would see you have about 12 states said that. And that makes sense, because if we went backwards, it would say this was about 11 and this was 1. So together it would make 12, okay? Is it possible to tell the height of the tallest point? Let's go back. Can you tell me how the height of the tallest point? No, you can't because they're in an interval. So you don't know if the tallest point was 6,250 or if the tallest point was 6,000 or if the tallest point was 5,001. You don't know because it's based on an interval. So if you remember, like the box and whisker, when we organize our data into these charts, we're not looking for exact numbers. We're just looking for representation of the numbers, and we can't use the exact numbers on these. So that's a disadvantage of using a histogram. Okay, so you can use this histogram to answer these questions. How many drivers had a speed of at least 70 miles per hour? So at the very least, 70 miles per hour. So you're going to do this bar right here along with this bar right here, because that's at the very least 70. Good. Is it possible to tell the lowest speed? No, we already discussed that. Because it's based on intervals, you can't tell the lowest speed. Using these two histograms to answer the following questions. First of all, make sure you read what you're talking about. We're talking about the trade industry and the service industry, and the number of employees and the number of states. So the number of employee in the trade industry in the number of states, and then this one is the number of employee in the service industry by state. So which business sector has more states between 1 million, 1,000, and 3 million? Go back. Which one has the most? Hopefully you said service. Next question is use these histograms for dining out. So you're dining out on the East Coast versus the West Coast, and the cost it is. Okay, so between $0 and $19, the number of people who spent that amount, between 20 and 39, the amount of people who spent that amount on the East Coast, and so on. So first question, which coast has more people spending at least $60 a week? So at the very least, so we're looking at this one and this one and this one and this one. But definitely West Coast, and that's it. So histograms are pretty easy. Again, a histogram is very much like a bar graph. The difference is there's no space between the bars, and the x-axis is intervals. And remember, the intervals have to be equal amounts.